The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of the Morrison Conservatory in Chicago, creating a rhythmic percussion that seemed to mock the nervous silence inside Studio 7. 17-year-old Maya Chen stood in the center of the room, her violin case clutched against her chest, her guide dog Beethoven sitting patiently at her feet. She couldn't see the 5 judges seated behind the long mahogany table, but she could feel their skepticism radiating across the space like heat from a furnace. "Name and age," came a bored voice from the panel. Maya recognized it from recordings she'd studied obsessively. Alexander Rothman, principal violinist of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, 3-time Grammy winner, and renowned for his uncompromising standards in classical music. Maya Chen, 17 years old, from Riverside, Illinois, she replied, her voice steady despite the thunder of her heartbeat. A pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "Riverside," another judge murmured. "That's quite far from the usual applicant pool." Maya heard the unspoken words beneath that observation. Riverside was a working-class suburb, miles away from the affluent neighborhoods that typically produced conservatory candidates. Her father worked double shifts at an automotive plant. Her mother cleaned offices downtown. The Morrison Conservatory's annual tuition exceeded their combined yearly income. "Miss Chen?" Rothman's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and precise as a scalpel. "I see here that you're applying for a full scholarship to our performance program. Do you understand the caliber of musicians who compete for those positions?" "Yes, sir," Maya replied. "I've studied the conservatory's history. I know that only 2 full scholarships are awarded annually, and that over 300 students audition each year." "Then you must also know," Rothman continued, and Maya could hear him rising from his chair, his footsteps approaching her position, "that, in my 15 years as a judge, I have never recommended a scholarship for a student who," he paused, and Maya could feel him studying her, "who faces such significant challenges." Maya's fingers tightened on her violin case. She had encountered this particular brand of discrimination her entire life, the careful, politically correct phrasing that disguised prejudice as concern. People who saw her white cane and assumed incapability, who heard about her blindness and immediately lowered their expectations. "Blindness is only a challenge if you let it define your limitations," Maya said quietly. "Music exists in sound, Mr. Rothman, not in sight." A soft laugh rippled through the panel. Not cruel exactly, but condescending in the way that stung more sharply than open mockery. "Admirable philosophy," Rothman replied, returning to his seat. "However, professional musicians must read complex scores, follow a conductor's visual cues, coordinate with other performers in an orchestra setting. These are not minor considerations, Miss Chen. They are fundamental requirements." Maya had prepared for this moment for 3 years. Since the day she'd heard about the Morrison Conservatory scholarship, she'd known that her biggest obstacle wouldn't be the audition piece itself, but convincing people that she deserved to be there at all. "Mr. Rothman," she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice, "may I ask what you played for your own audition to Juilliard?" The silence that followed was different, sharper. Maya had clearly crossed some invisible line. "I beg your pardon?" Rothman's voice had lost its bored politeness, taking on an edge that made Beethoven shift restlessly at her feet. "I've listened to interviews where you discussed your Juilliard audition," Maya continued, her heart racing but her words carefully measured. "You played Paganini's Caprice No. 24. You've said it was the most technically demanding piece you'd encountered at that age. You were 17, the same age I am now. Your point being?" "My point is that you chose a piece specifically to prove something. To show that you weren't just another talented student, but someone exceptional. Someone who deserved recognition despite coming from a modest background in Cleveland. Despite your teachers telling you that Juilliard was beyond your reach." The room had gone completely silent, except for the rain and the faint ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the corner. "You've done your research," Rothman said coldly. "But research and performance are entirely different matters. What piece have you prepared for today's audition?" Maya set down her violin case and carefully opened it, her fingers finding the familiar contours of her instrument. A beautiful mid-19th century violin, her grandmother had brought from Taiwan, the only valuable possession their family owned. She lifted it gently, reverently, and positioned it under her chin. "I'll be performing Sarasate's Zigunerweisen," she announced. Someone on the panel, Maya thought it might be Judge Harrison, a cellist she'd read about, gasped audibly. "That's a concert piece," Rothman said flatly. "Not an audition piece. It's nearly 10 minutes long and requires orchestral accompaniment." "I'm aware," Maya replied. "I'll be performing it solo, with the accompaniment memorized and interpreted through variation in tone and phrasing." "That's impossible," another judge interjected. No 17-year-old could manage the technical complexity while simultaneously accounting for the missing orchestral elements. Maya smiled for the first time since entering the room. It wasn't a confident smile, exactly. It was something deeper, the quiet certainty of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment of doubt. "Mr. Rothman," she said softly, "you once told an interviewer that the purpose of music isn't to do what's possible. It's to make people believe in what they thought was impossible." I memorized that quote. It's been taped to my practice room wall since I was 14. She heard Rothman shift in his chair, the leather creaking, a long exhale. "Very well, Miss Chen," he said. And there was something new in his voice. Not quite respect, but a recognition that he'd underestimated her preparation. "You have 10 minutes. Make them count." Maya positioned her bow, closed her eyes, a habit from before her blindness, meaningless now but comforting, and began to play. The first notes of Zigunerweisen emerged from her violin, like a whisper transforming into a shout. The piece, written by Spanish composer Pablo de Sarasate, was a showpiece designed to display every possible virtuosic technique. Rapid-fire passages that tested the limits of bow control, soaring melodic lines that demanded perfect intonation, pizzicato sections that required the left hand to pluck strings while the bow hand prepared for the next phrase. But Maya wasn't just executing techniques. She was telling a story. Her grandmother had taught her the history of this piece before she died. It was inspired by the Romani people, their struggles and triumphs, their music that emerged from hardship and discrimination. Maya poured into every note her own experience. The accident that had stolen her sight at age 12. The doctors who said she'd never play again. The music teachers who refused to take her seriously. The classmates who pitied her. The strangers who spoke to her in loud, slow voices, as if blindness also affected hearing. In the practice room she'd built in her family's garage, insulated with egg cartons and carpet remnants, her father brought home from work. Maya had spent thousands of hours not just memorizing this piece, but inhabiting it. She'd studied recordings from Itzhak Perlman, Anne-Sophie Mutter, and Joshua Bell. She'd analyzed the emotional architecture of every phrase, the way silence between notes could be as powerful as sound itself. Now, in Studio 7 of the Morrison Conservatory, she unleashed everything she'd learned. The rapid chromatic runs in the opening section flew from her fingers with such precision that it sounded like 2 violins playing in harmony. When she reached the haunting Spanish-inflected melody in the second section, her vibrato captured a quality of longing that made the listening experience almost painful in its beauty. Judge Harrison, the cellist, found tears streaming down her face without quite knowing why. Alexander Rothman sat frozen in his chair, his carefully maintained expression of professional detachment cracking with each passing measure. He had heard this piece performed hundreds of times by some of the world's finest violinists. But this 17-year-old girl from a working-class suburb was doing something he'd never witnessed. She was playing the orchestral accompaniment through the violin itself, varying her tone and dynamics so precisely that the listener's mind filled in the missing instruments. It was impossible. And yet, it was happening. When Maya reached the pyrotechnical finale, a section that pushed even professional violinists to their limits, her left hand flew across the fingerboard with such speed that her fingers seemed to blur. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, each one crystal clear, each phrase building toward the climactic conclusion. She held the final note, letting it decay naturally in the acoustic space, and then lowered her violin slowly, carefully, as if placing a sleeping child in a crib. The The silence that followed was profound. Maya stood motionless, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the judges could hear it. Beethoven remained perfectly still at her feet, trained never to interrupt a performance. Then Judge Harrison began to clap. Slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. Another judge joined, then another, until 4 of the 5 panel members were applauding. Alexander Rothman remained seated, his hands folded on the table in front of him. "Thank you, Miss Chen," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "That will be all. Results will be posted in 3 weeks." Maya nodded, carefully placed her violin back in its case, and let Beethoven guide her toward the door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the handle. As she reached the exit, Rothman's voice stopped her. "Miss Chen." She turned back toward the panel. "Where did you study?" he asked. "Which teacher prepared you for this audition?" Maya hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I don't have a private teacher, Mr. Rothman. I couldn't afford one. I learned from YouTube videos, online masterclasses, and recordings from the library. My father built me a practice room in our garage. That's where I've spent 6 hours a day for the past 3 years." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier. "I see," Rothman said quietly. "Thank you for your time." Maya left the studio, Beethoven guiding her through the elegant corridors of the conservatory toward the exit where her father waited in their aging sedan. She had no way of knowing that behind the closed door of Studio 7, Alexander Rothman was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, genuine uncertainty. "We have to give her the scholarship," Judge Harrison was saying, her voice still thick with emotion. "That was extraordinary. I've been teaching for 25 years, and I've never heard anything like." "No," Rothman interrupted flatly. "Alex, you can't be serious. She's clearly the most talented applicant we've seen this year." "Talent isn't the issue," Rothman replied, standing and gathering his papers. "The practical considerations are insurmountable. How would she participate in ensemble work? How would she follow a conductor? How would she navigate touring schedules and performance venues? We would be setting her up for failure." Or, another judge interjected carefully, "we would be afraid of admitting that our systems and structures are designed for a narrow definition of how a musician should work." Rothman's jaw tightened. "This conversation is over. We'll reconvene for final deliberations next week. In the meantime, I suggest we all remember that we're evaluating candidates for professional careers, not running a charity program for inspirational stories." He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. But as he drove home that evening, Alexander Rothman couldn't stop hearing Maya Chen's performance, replaying in his mind. Every note perfectly placed, every phrase infused with an emotional depth that most musicians spent lifetimes trying to achieve. And for the first time in many years, he felt something that made him deeply uncomfortable. The recognition that his own prejudices, carefully disguised as pragmatism and professional standards, had nearly caused him to miss witnessing genuine genius. The question was whether he would let that recognition change his decision, or whether his fear of disrupting established systems would win out. In 3 weeks, Maya Chen would learn the answer. But the real story was only beginning. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., 3 weeks and 2 days after Maya's audition. She was in the garage practice room when her phone's text-to-speech function read the subject line, "Morrison Conservatory, Scholarship Decision." Her hands, which had been warming up with scales, froze on the violin strings. "Read the email," she commanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The synthetic voice began, "Dear Miss Chen, we regret to inform you that after careful consideration, the Scholarship Committee has decided to award the full performance scholarships to other candidates this year. While we were impressed by certain aspects of your audition," Maya stopped listening. She carefully set down her violin and sat on the folding chair her father had positioned against the wall. Beethoven immediately moved to her side, pressing his warm body against her leg. She wasn't surprised. Exactly. She'd felt the resistance in that room, heard the skepticism in Alexander Rothman's voice. But she had dared to hope. That performance had been everything she'd worked toward, everything she was capable of delivering. Apparently, it wasn't enough. Maya? Her mother's voice came from the garage door. I heard your phone. Was that the conservatory? I didn't get it, Maya said simply. Her mother crossed the practice room and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Their loss, baby. Their loss. But as Maya sat there in her mother's embrace, something unexpected began to kindle in her chest. Not despair. Not even disappointment anymore. Anger. 3 weeks later, Maya stood outside the Morrison Conservatory's grand concert hall, her hand on Beethoven's harness, listening to the sounds of Chicago's classical music elite filing inside for the annual scholarship showcase. The 2 students who had won the full scholarships would perform tonight, along with several partial scholarship recipients. Maya hadn't been invited. She'd bought a ticket with money saved from teaching beginner violin lessons to neighborhood kids. You sure about this? Her father asked quietly. He'd taken the evening off work to accompany her. I'm sure, Maya replied. What her father didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Maya had done some research in the weeks following her rejection. Through online forums and careful conversations with current conservatory students, she'd uncovered something troubling. The 2 students who'd received full scholarships this year were both from wealthy families with long-standing connections to the conservatory's board of directors. One was the grandson of a major donor. The other's father sat on the board itself. This pattern repeated when Maya looked at previous years. The conservatory's full scholarships, supposedly awarded on merit alone, went almost exclusively to students with family connections or significant financial resources. It was a closed system, dressed up in the language of artistic excellence and rigorous standards. As Maya and her father found their seats in the concert hall, she heard familiar voices nearby. Judge Harrison, the cellist from her audition panel, was speaking with another musician. I still can't believe Alex blocked her scholarship, Harrison was saying, her voice tight with frustration. That girl was extraordinary. The most naturally gifted violinist I've heard in a decade. You know how Alexander is, her companion replied. He sees the conservatory as his kingdom. Change threatens the order he's built. Maya listened intently, her fingers drumming against her thigh in a rhythm only she could hear. The showcase began with a piano performance, technically proficient but emotionally hollow. Then came a cello piece, competently executed but forgettable. Maya sat through each performance, her mind working through a plan that had been forming since the rejection email. Finally, Alexander Rothman took the stage to introduce the full scholarship recipients. It is my great pleasure, he announced in his commanding baritone, to present 2 extraordinary young musicians who represent the future of classical music. First, performing Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major, please welcome James Pemberton. The applause was polite, refined. Maya heard James take the stage, the whisper of expensive formal wear, the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in spaces like this. His performance of the Tchaikovsky was technically sound. Every note was correct, every passage cleanly executed. But it lacked fire, lacked the soul that transformed technical skill into art. When he finished, the applause was generous, enthusiastic even. But Maya noticed something in the quality of the sound. The slight hesitation before it began. The way it faded quickly. This was obligatory appreciation, not genuine moved response. Thank you, James, Rothman said warmly. Exceptional. As always. Now, for our second scholarship recipient, performing Brahms' Violin Sonata No. 3. Please welcome Catherine Morrison. Morrison, as in the Morrison family, who had founded the conservatory 75 years ago, Catherine's performance was similar to James's, technically proficient, emotionally reserved, the musical equivalent of a perfectly composed thank you note. As the applause faded, Maya made her decision. She stood up. Excuse me, she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Mr. Rothman, may I ask a question? The concert hall fell silent. Maya heard her father's sharp intake of breath beside her. Young lady, Rothman's voice came from the stage, tight with irritation. This is not the appropriate venue for questions. If you have concerns, please contact the conservatory's administrative office. My question is simple, Maya continued, her heart pounding but her voice steady. How does the scholarship committee ensure that decisions are based purely on artistic merit and not on family connections or financial contributions? A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the audience. I assure you, Rothman replied coldly, that our selection process is rigorous and objective. Now, if you'll please. Then why? Maya interrupted. And she heard her father try to gently pull her back into her seat. Why have 8 of the last 10 full scholarship recipients come from families with direct ties to the conservatory's board or major donors? The whispers grew louder. Maya could feel the shift in the room's energy: confusion, surprise, and, from some quarters, recognition. Young lady, I don't know who you are, but these accusations are inappropriate and frankly slanderous. Security, please escort. My name is Maya Chen, she said loudly, clearly. I auditioned for a full scholarship 3 weeks ago. I was rejected despite, according to Judge Harrison's own words, delivering one of the most naturally gifted performances she'd heard in a decade. She heard Harrison gasp somewhere to her left. I don't care that I was rejected, Maya continued, and she was surprised to find this was true. What I care about is that talented students from working-class families, students who spend their lives practicing in makeshift garage studios because they can't afford private teachers, those students never get a fair chance. Not because they lack talent, but because they lack connections. This is outrageous, Rothman sputtered. You have no evidence for these claims. You're simply a bitter applicant who couldn't meet our standards. Actually, came a new voice from the side of the concert hall. She has quite a bit of evidence. Maya turned her head toward the voice. She didn't recognize it. My name is Dr. Sarah Lynn, the woman continued, and Maya heard footsteps approaching the stage. I'm an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, and I've been researching the Morrison Conservatory's scholarship practices for the past 6 months. Miss Chen's observations align perfectly with the data I've compiled. The room erupted. Voices overlapping. People standing. The scrape of chairs against the polished floor. This is absurd, Rothman shouted over the commotion. This showcase is over. Everyone please exit the hall immediately. But Dr. Lynn's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Rothman, would you care to comment on why you personally blocked Maya Chen's scholarship despite unanimous support from the other 4 judges on your panel? The silence that followed was absolute. Maya stood perfectly still. Beethoven pressed against her leg, her father's hand on her shoulder. That's confidential committee business, Rothman said finally. But his voice had lost its commanding authority. Judge Harrison, Dr. Lynn continued, is it true that Maya Chen received the highest technical scores of any audition candidate this year? From somewhere in the audience, Harrison's voice emerged, shaking but clear. And is it true that Alexander Rothman overrode the committee's recommendation to award her a scholarship, citing concerns about her blindness, creating logistical challenges? Yes, Harrison said more firmly. I submitted my formal protest in writing. I was told to withdraw it or face removal from the panel. The room exploded again. Maya heard voices. She recognized prominent musicians, donors, board members all talking at once, demanding answers, expressing shock and outrage. In the chaos, Maya felt a hand on her arm. Judge Harrison, I'm so sorry, Harrison whispered urgently. I should have fought harder. I should have gone public immediately. I was afraid of losing my position, but that's no excuse. You deserved that scholarship. You deserved so much more than this. It's okay, Maya said, and meant it. You're fighting now. That's what matters. On stage, Alexander Rothman stood alone, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. The board members were already conferring in urgent whispers. The Tribune reporter was documenting everything. The audience, including several influential critics and musicians, had witnessed not just the exposure of corruption, but the silencing of extraordinary talent for the preservation of privilege. Ladies and gentlemen, came a commanding voice from the back of the hall. Maya recognized it from board meeting recordings she'd studied. Margaret Morrison, herself, matriarch of the founding family. This showcase is indeed concluded. The board will convene an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. All scholarship decisions from the past 5 years will be independently reviewed. Mr. Rothman, your presence will not be required. The implication was clear. Rothman's career at the conservatory, possibly his career in classical music entirely, was over. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya felt Dr. Lin approach. Miss Chen, I'd like to interview you for my article. But first, I have a question. How did you know about the scholarship patterns? That was extremely difficult data to compile. Maya smiled. I'm blind, Dr. Lin, not helpless. I taught myself database analysis using screen reader software. Once I suspected something was wrong, I compiled every piece of public information I could find about scholarship recipients, cross-referenced it with conservatory board records, and ran statistical analyses on family connections and financial contributions. The correlation was statistically impossible to explain by chance alone. Dr. Lin laughed, a sound of genuine delight. You're remarkable. But I have to ask, what happens now? Your scholarship was denied. How do you plan to continue your training? Maya hadn't thought that far ahead. In her mind, exposing the injustice had been the goal. The endpoint. I don't know, she admitted. Then perhaps, came another voice, one Maya didn't recognize. You'll allow me to make a suggestion. The man who spoke introduced himself as Dr. James Chen, no relation, director of the Berklee College of Music's Global Outreach Program. Miss Chen, I was in the audience tonight by coincidence. I'm in Chicago for a conference. But I've just witnessed something I've never seen before. A 17-year-old student with enough courage to challenge a corrupt system and enough brilliance to back it up with data. Berklee would be honored to offer you a full scholarship if you're interested. Maya's father made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Additionally, Dr. Chen continued, I'd like to invite you to perform at our annual showcase in Boston next month. I think the world deserves to hear what the Morrison Conservatory tried to silence. As Maya stood in that concert hall, surrounded by the wreckage of an unjust system and the beginning of something new, she realized something profound. She had come here tonight, thinking she needed the conservatory's approval to validate her talent. She'd been wrong. Her talent had always been valid. What she'd needed was the courage to demand the recognition it deserved, regardless of who tried to deny it. Dr. Chen, Maya said, extending her hand, I accept your offer. All of it. The handshake that followed sealed more than a scholarship. It marked the beginning of a career that would transform classical music's understanding of accessibility, excellence, and the dangerous comfort of tradition. But that night, Maya simply let her father drive her home, Beethoven sleeping in the back seat, her violin case secure beside her. Tomorrow would bring interviews, opportunities, and the beginning of a journey she'd only dreamed about. Tonight, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in the 3 weeks since her rejection: hope. 6 months after the Morrison Conservatory scandal, Maya Chen walked onto the stage of Symphony Hall in Boston for her debut performance with the Berklee Global Orchestra. At 18, she was the youngest soloist ever featured in the venue's 112-year history. The scandal had made national news. Alexander Rothman had resigned in disgrace, his illustrious career ended by his own prejudice, disguised as standards. The Morrison Conservatory had undergone a complete restructuring of its scholarship program, with independent oversight and blind auditions, a term that took on new meaning given the catalyst for change. But Maya tried not to think about any of that, as she stood in the wings, her violin case in one hand, Beethoven's harness in the other. You ready? Asked Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Berklee's renowned violin instructor, who had become Maya's mentor. Terrified, Maya admitted with a slight laugh. Good, Dr. Tanaka replied. The day you're not nervous before a major performance is the day you've lost respect for the music. Maya nodded, listening to the sounds of the audience settling into their seats. The hall could hold 2,600 people. Tonight, it was sold out. Critics from every major publication were in attendance. Several recording labels had sent representatives. The performance would be live-streamed globally. No pressure at all. 5 minutes, the stage manager called. Maya took Beethoven to his designated spot in the wings. He'd wait there throughout the performance, as he always did, and picked up her violin. The same instrument her grandmother had brought from Taiwan. The same instrument that had carried her through thousands of hours of practice in a converted garage. Now it would carry her through the most important performance of her life. Dr. Tanaka touched her shoulder briefly. Remember what we practiced. The music already exists inside you. You're just allowing it to emerge. Maya stepped onto the stage. The applause washed over her like a wave. She'd experienced standing ovations at Berkeley, but this was different. Bigger. The sound seemed to come from all directions, filling the acoustic space of one of America's most prestigious concert halls. She took her position at center stage, feeling the warmth of the stage lights on her face, hearing the rustle of the orchestra members behind her readying their instruments. The conductor, Maestro Ricardo Alvarez, approached and spoke quietly. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Chen." Maya raised her violin and bowed to playing position. The hall fell silent. She had chosen to perform Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, a piece written in 1844 that had become a benchmark for violinists worldwide. It required technical brilliance, emotional depth, and the ability to create an intimate conversation between soloist and orchestra despite performing for thousands. The orchestra began the introduction, 8 measures that established the melodic themes Maya would soon transform. She counted the beats, feeling the conductor's patterns through the air currents his baton created, listening to the spaces between notes where her entrance would emerge. Then she began to play. The first phrase of the Mendelssohn is deceptively simple, a singing melody that rises and falls like a bird in flight. But within that simplicity lies every emotion Mendelssohn had poured into the composition. Longing, joy, melancholy, hope. Maya had spent 6 months not just learning the notes, but understanding the story. Mendelssohn had written this concerto for his friend Ferdinand David, a violinist of extraordinary talent. He'd composed it during a period of personal happiness, but also growing awareness of his own mortality. Every phrase contained that bittersweet recognition of beauty's fragility. As Maya played, she channeled her own understanding of that duality. The joy of finally being recognized for her talent. The awareness that her opportunity had come through exposing others' failures rather than purely through her own merit. The knowledge that she carried the hopes of countless students with disabilities who'd been told they didn't belong in classical music. In the audience, Dr. Sarah Lynn, the journalist who had broken the conservatory scandal, found tears streaming down her face. She'd covered hundreds of classical concerts in her career. She'd never heard anyone play with this level of emotional authenticity. 3 rows behind her, Judge Harrison from the Morrison Conservatory panel sat with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She'd resigned from the conservatory after the scandal, unable to continue working in an institution that had valued connections over excellence. Tonight, hearing Maya perform, she felt both vindicated in her initial assessment and ashamed of how long it had taken her to fight for what was right. As the first movement progressed, Maya navigated the technical challenges with seemingly effortless precision. The rapid double-stop passages, the soaring high notes that required perfect intonation, the intricate dialogue with the orchestra, all executed with a maturity that belied her age. But what distinguished her performance wasn't just technical mastery. It was the way she listened. Between her phrases, in the moments when the orchestra carried the melody, Maya's face showed complete engagement with every instrumental voice. She wasn't just performing with the orchestra. She was conversing with them, responding to their interpretations, allowing the music to emerge as a genuine collaborative creation. Maestro Alvarez, conducting from the podium, found himself making subtle adjustments to his interpretation based on Maya's responses. In 40 years of conducting, he'd rarely encountered a soloist so completely present in the musical moment. The second movement, marked Andante, began with a gentle melody that showcased Maya's lyrical playing. Here, The technical pyrotechnics of the first movement gave way to pure singing tone. Each note needed to breathe, to connect to the next with the inevitability of one wave following another. Maya thought of her grandmother as she played this movement, the woman who had carried this violin across an ocean, who had taught Maya that music wasn't about performance, it was about transmission, about carrying something precious from one generation to the next, allowing it to be transformed by each person's experience while maintaining its essential truth. In the front row, Margaret Morrison sat with her daughter Catherine, the scholarship recipient, whose performance had been so outshone by the scandal. Catherine had insisted on attending tonight, despite her mother's reservations. "She's incredible," Catherine whispered. "Not for the first time." Margaret nodded slowly. She'd spent decades on the conservatory board, believing she was preserving excellence and tradition. Tonight, listening to this blind girl from a working-class family perform with a depth and skill that few could match, she finally understood what she'd actually been preserving: her own comfort, her own power, her own limited definition of who deserved access to beauty. The second movement concluded with a phrase so tender it seemed to hang in the air even after the sound had ceased. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of reverent quiet that only emerges when an audience has been genuinely moved. Then, without pause, the orchestra launched into the final movement. This was where Mendelssohn had unleashed his full compositional genius, a movement that combined technical fireworks with thematic development, requiring the soloist to maintain musical coherence while executing passages that pushed the limits of what a violin could do. Maya attacked it with fierce joy. Her bow flew across the strings, her left hand danced across the fingerboard, and somehow, impossibly, every note rang clear and true. The rapid passage work that typically sounded like a blur of notes instead emerged as a crystalline cascade, each individual pitch audible and meaningful. She wasn't just playing fast, she was playing with intelligence, making compositional choices in real time, emphasizing inner voices that most violinists neglected, creating moments of unexpected breath and space that made the technical passages serve the musical narrative rather than existing as mere displays of virtuosity. The orchestra responded with increased energy, the collective sound growing more intense as Maya led them toward the concerto's triumphant conclusion. In the wings, Beethoven lifted his head, his tail wagging slightly. He couldn't see his companion on stage, but he could hear her, and he could sense through some mysterious animal intuition that something extraordinary was happening. Dr. Tanaka stood beside the guide dog, her own eyes closed, listening to her student fulfill the promise she'd recognized from their first lesson. Maya had arrived at Berkeley with astonishing technical skills, but relatively little formal training in performance practice, orchestral collaboration, or the subtle interpretive choices that distinguished good musicians from great ones. In 6 months, she'd absorbed everything Dr. Tanaka could teach and synthesized it into something uniquely her own. This wasn't merely excellent playing. This was the emergence of a major artistic voice. As Maya approached the final pages of the concerto, she felt something she'd never experienced before: complete confidence. Not arrogance, but the deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The final phrase built to the concerto's climactic moment, a sustained high note that needed to ring out with triumph and resolution. Maya held it, her bow moving steadily, the note pure and unwavering, seeming to expand, to fill every corner of the massive hall. Then, in perfect synchronization with the orchestra's final chord, she released it. Silence. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3. Then the audience exploded. The ovation was instantaneous and overwhelming. People leapt to their feet, applauding with an intensity that made the hall itself seem to vibrate. Critics who'd spent careers maintaining professional detachment were shouting, "Brava," alongside first-time concert-goers. The orchestra members, still seated, were tapping their bows against their music stands, in the traditional musician's applause. Maya stood center stage, her violin and bow at her sides, listening to the sound wash over her. She felt Maestro Alvarez touch her shoulder gently, guiding her through the traditional bows, one to the audience, one to the orchestra, one more to the audience, as the applause somehow grew even louder. The ovation continued for 12 minutes. Maya was called back for 6 curtain calls. On the 4th one, Beethoven broke his training slightly, letting out a single enthusiastic bark from the wings that made the audience laugh and applaud even harder. Finally, Maya raised her hand for silence. "Thank you," she said, her voice amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics. "Thank you all so much. But I need to say something before we finish tonight." The hall quieted, people settling back into their seats. 6 months ago, I was told that my blindness made me unsuitable for a career in classical music. I was told that the logistical challenges would be insurmountable, that I couldn't meet the standards required of professional musicians. She paused, letting the words settle. I want to be clear. Those people were wrong. Not because I'm special, but because their understanding of what makes a great musician was fundamentally limited. Music doesn't require sight. It requires listening, discipline, passion, and the courage to be vulnerable in front of strangers. Someone in the balcony shouted yes, others murmured agreement. But I also want to acknowledge something important, Maya continued. I wouldn't be standing here tonight if not for people who chose to act when they witnessed injustice. Dr. Sarah Lynn, who investigated the conservatory's practices, Judge Harrison, who risked her career to protest my rejection, Dr. James Chen, who offered me an opportunity when others closed their doors, Dr. Tanaka, who pushed me to become not just a better player, but a better artist. She turned slightly toward the orchestra. And these incredible musicians, who spent the last 6 months treating me as an equal collaborator, never once suggesting that my blindness was an obstacle to overcome rather than simply one characteristic among many. Maya faced the audience again. I'm sharing my story tonight not because I want pity or admiration, but because there are thousands of talented young musicians from marginalized communities, students with disabilities, students from working-class families, students whose excellence doesn't match traditional expectations, who are being systematically excluded from opportunities they've earned. Her voice grew stronger. The question I want to leave you with is this. How much beauty are we missing because we've confused tradition with excellence? How many voices have we silenced because they don't sound the way we expect genius to sound? The silence in the hall was absolute. Thank you for listening tonight, Maya concluded simply. The ovation that followed was different from the first. It was slower to build, but somehow deeper. People weren't just applauding a performance anymore. They were acknowledging a shift, a recognition that excellence comes in forms they'd been trained not to see. As Maya left the stage, Beethoven immediately at her side. She was surrounded by well-wishers. Recording label executives handed her cards. Critics asked for interviews. Other students with disabilities waited to thank her for representing them. But the moment that mattered most came 2 hours later, as Maya was finally leaving the venue. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, approached with her mother. Miss Chen, the girl said shyly, I'm Emma. I play cello. I have cerebral palsy, and my music teacher said I should probably just listen to music instead of trying to play it because of my disability. Maya knelt down to the girl's level. Emma, can I tell you something important? Yes. Your teacher is wrong. Not because your cerebral palsy isn't real or doesn't create challenges, but because challenges aren't the same as impossibilities. Will you have to work differently than other students? Probably. Will you need to find adaptations and techniques that work for your body? Absolutely. But none of that means you can't play. It just means you'll learn to play your own way. Really? Emma's voice was trembling. Really? Maya said firmly. Promise me you won't give up. I promise. As Emma and her mother walked away, Dr. Tanaka touched Maya's shoulder. You know what you've done tonight, don't you? Played a concerto? Maya replied with a slight smile. Change the conversation, Dr. Tanaka corrected. Not just about disability in music, but about who gets to define excellence. Who gets to say what genius looks like, sounds like, moves like. That's the real revolution. Maya thought about that as her father drove her back to their hotel, Beethoven sleeping in the back seat, her violin case secure beside her. The performance had been technically successful. The reviews, which would start appearing tomorrow, would be unanimously positive. Several recording contracts would be offered, but the true success was simpler. She had played the music exactly as it deserved to be played. With honesty, vulnerability, and technical mastery, in service of emotional truth. Everything else, the advocacy, the inspiration, the challenge to classical music's gatekeepers, was important. But secondary, the music was what mattered. The music, and the recognition that it belonged to everyone who had the courage to pursue it, regardless of who told them they didn't fit the mold. As Maya drifted off to sleep that night, her last conscious thought was of the Mendelssohn Concerto's opening phrase, that simple, singing melody that rose and fell like hope itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, she had proven that talent doesn't require traditional packaging, that genius can emerge from makeshift practice rooms and converted garages, that the most dangerous thing in art isn't the absence of skill, it's the presence of prejudice disguised as standards. Maya Chen slept soundly, her violin beside her, a new chapter of her life, already beginning. The sound of triumph wasn't in the applause, though that had been gratifying. It was in the quiet certainty that she had played with complete authenticity, had shared her truth through music, and had opened a door that others would now be brave enough to walk through. That was the real performance. Everything else was just the beginning. The end,